All right, let's go ahead and go onto the section boasting in the flesh. Galatians 6, verse 13. For not even those who are circumcised keep the law, but they desire to have you circumcised, that they might boast in your flesh. Now, what does he mean by that? He's talking again to the Galatians about, and by the way, the big issue in the book of Galatians that is being battled. Paul is writing to the Galatian Christians who are being kind of hounded by some of the Jewish Christians that had converted to Christianity, the Jews, that are saying they needed to keep all of the ceremonial laws and all the Mosaic law in addition to the Ten Commandments. And Paul was saying, don't let them put all of those things on you. They're just trying to sort of brand you and boast in your flesh. And you've probably seen that before. You get into some of these religions that have certain peculiar doctrines that sort of make them stand out. Some churches, the women can't come into church unless they cover their heads. And they may feel when they can study with you and finally get you to agree to cover your head, that they've won a victory. Now, you may have all kinds of other problems in your life, but as long as you've covered your head, they feel like you're one of us. You've been branded. We've won you over with our doctrine. I've got some friends, there may be some here today, that have been in prison. And they said one of the first things that happens when you get into prison, some of these larger prisons, there's just a whole spectrum of gangs. And all the different subgroups and gangs have got their tattoo logos that tell what gang you're in. And if you're not in one gang, then you have no protection and you're harassed by all gangs. And so one of the new people that come in, all the various gangs kind of work on them and say, if you're smart, you'll be part of our gang. And we'll brand you, and they give them the tattoo of that gang. And they say, aha, we've got them, you're one of us now. And there was almost this mindset among the Jewish Christians that when the Gentile Christians accepted Jesus, they said, now you've got to be circumcised. We want you to be a real Christian. Not just one of these Gentile halfway Christians, but be a real Christian and be a real child of Abraham. And Paul was saying, they're not even keeping the law of Moses. They just want to boast in your flesh. You see what he's saying? They want to brand you so that they can feel like, they've got some accomplishment, and it's pride. Trying to say, I won an argument. Have you ever seen two people trying to argue over doctrine, and neither of them are converted? And they're proud about their doctrinal positions and their theology, and they want to win the debate. They want to win the argument, but is anyone ever saved in those debates? No, that's not the right spirit. So Paul is talking about having other people boast in your flesh. Now then Paul, he says, I'm going to give you an example. He says, if anyone can boast in the flesh, I can boast in the flesh. And he says, for example, and you look in 2 Corinthians 11. This is not the first time that Paul was facing these issues. 2 Corinthians 11, verse 21 to 30. He's talking about an example of boasting in the flesh. And he says, to our shame, I say, that we were too weak for that. But in whatever anyone is bold, I speak foolishly. He's prefacing what he's about to say. He says, this is going to sound very proud and foolish and selfish. It's going to sound immature for a Christian. I speak foolishly. I am bold. I'm bold also. Are they Hebrews? Again, he's talking about the Jewish believers that were trying to get all the Gentile believers to keep all of the Mosaic laws and the feast days. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Now, what made Paul a Hebrew? His spirit or his flesh? His flesh. He was genetically a Hebrew. So he's boasting in his flesh. You see what he's saying here? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they of the seed of Abraham? Again, he's saying, I'm just as Jewish as they are, and I'm telling you, you don't have to be circumcised. I'm just as Jewish in my flesh as they are. I've got the same reasons to boast that they've got to boast, and I'm telling you, you don't have to keep these ceremonial annual feast days. And there's still people around that are pushing that. So am I. Are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool. He feels so guilty saying it. Twice he says, I'm talking like a fool, but I've got to make a point. By the way, why does he say I speak as a fool and he keeps speaking? Solomon gives a proverb, and someone might even look it up and remind me. I forget what the verse is, but it says, answer a fool according to his folly, or he will be wise in his own eyes. Then immediately afterward it says, answer not a fool, or you sound like him. So in one breath he says, don't answer a fool or you sound like him. The next breath he says, answer a fool or he's wise in his own eyes, meaning you don't win when you're trying to answer a foolish question. But sometimes you have to address those things on an elementary level. So that's what Paul says. I'm sorry, I know I sound like a fool, but if anyone's got a reason to boast, I do. And then he goes on and says, I am a Jew. I am a son of Abraham. I'm an Israelite. I'm a minister. I speak as a fool. I'm more. In labors, he said, I've got more to boast about than they do. And listen to this, is quite a legacy here. In labors more abundant, in stripes above measure. I've lost count of how many times I've been whipped. When a person was whipped, it left stripes. You know, it says with Jesus, with his stripes we are healed. With stripes above measure, in prison more frequently, in deaths often. From the Jews, 5 times I received 40 stripes minus 1. Not the Jewish Christians, but the Jews in Jerusalem. 5 times, whipped 39 times. Wow. They believe Jesus may have been whipped twice, 39 times before the cross. Paul says 5 times. And then when we get to the end of the letter, you know, we've already read it. He says, I bear in my body the marks of the Lord Jesus. Do you think Paul was scarred? He got a lot of faith. 3 times I was beaten with rods. I don't know how many of you remember the story about, was it Singapore? That some young American had, he spray painted some graffiti somewhere and he was arrested. Was it Michael Fay? Was that the name? And they had a law. They were going to beat him with a rod. Just 3 whacks with a bamboo pole. Anyone remember this? Oh boy, folks just went ballistic in America. This savage, barbaric treatment. And just got to be careful not to spray graffiti in Singapore. That's the law. And but it, you know, it leaves a welt. It really hurts. And in some cases it can even scar. And after all of the intercession of the American government and people, you know, campaigning, they still did it. They said, this is the law. He's here. You got to keep our laws in our country. Doesn't matter if you have a fit. And since then, they haven't had very many Americans spraying graffiti in Singapore, is what I understand, which says something about penalties for the law. It says he was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. Not too many people can say they were stoned to death. Now, when Paul was stoned, this is interesting, and I've got a theory, and I don't know. He may have actually been stoned to death, and God resurrected him. There's no way of really knowing. It says, while all the disciples stood around, one of them should have got down there and prayed for a resurrection, but since none of them got down and prayed for him to be resurrected, they walked off assuming he was dead. Maybe he was. But since none of the church went over and said, Lord, raise him up, God says, look, I'll have to do it myself because I'm not done with Paul. All of a sudden, he starts to move around and grow, and he gets up, dusts himself off, and he's able to make a trip that same day after being stoned to death. Once I was stoned. I mean, can you understand what that's like? That would be like you and I saying, I was even hung once. I was electrocuted once in the electric chair. I mean, that was an execution sentence when someone was stoned. It was written up in the Bible as the death penalty. It's amazing what he went through. And then he says, 3 times I was shipwrecked. Now, some of you have heard me share this before, an amazing fact. How many of you can say you were shipwrecked 3 times? I capsized my sunfish sailboat numerous times, but that's not quite the same thing as being shipwrecked. An amazing fact about the unsinkable Violet Jessup. Maybe you've heard this amazing fact before from somebody who was on the Titanic. Violet Jessup experienced and survived an almost unbelievable array of events. Listen, Violet was born in 1887 in Argentina of Irish parents who had immigrated from Dublin. In 1903, she sailed to England and fell in love with the sea while crossing the Atlantic. At 21, Violet became a stewardess for White Star Lines, which was engaged in building a trio of the world's largest luxury ocean liners. The 3 sister ships were the Olympic, the Britannic, and the Titanic. Violet first served on the Olympic, which she loved. She stated that she was quite fond of Americans, that even though they were often arrogant, they were less demanding than other passengers and treated her more like a person. While serving upon the Olympic in 1911, the ship experienced a violent collision with the British warship HMS Hawke. Considering the damage, it was a miracle that neither vessel sank. They limped back to shore, and the Olympic was ultimately repaired. The following year, at her friend's urging, she joined the crew of the newest ship, the Titanic. Violet was asleep when the Titanic hit the iceberg. Up on deck, she saw passengers calmly strolling about, but soon the women were clinging to their husbands as the crew tried to force them into the lifeboats with their children. At this point, a ship's officer handed Violet a misplaced baby and ordered her into boat 16 to show the other women it was safe. From the water, she witnessed all the terrors of the Titanic sinking. After being rescued by the ship the Carpathia, the baby was reunited with its mother. During the First World War, Violet served in 1916 as a nurse with the British Red Cross. Incredibly, she was now aboard the Britannica, which had been converted into a hospital ship, when it struck a mine, exploded, and sank in the Aegean Sea. Violet grabbed her toothbrush before rushing from the cabin, saying later that the one thing that she remembered missing when she survived the Titanic was her toothbrush. So she instinctively, she says, "Oh, here we go again." She says, "I'm getting my toothbrush." That's amazing how a person's mind works. As the Britannic was quickly going down, she was forced to jump into the water. She says, "I leapt into the water, but was sucked under the ship's keel, which struck my head." She attributed her survival to her very thick auburn hair that padded the blow. At the war's end, she bobbed to the surface and was rescued. At the war's end, Violet rejoined the White Star Lines, which once again had activated the ship, the Olympic, which she did not wreck on again. This Christian woman survived 42 years at sea, 3 historic shipwrecks, 2 world wars. She retired to gardening in Suffolk, England. I would have retired sooner, where she lived till age 84. So there you got someone else that survived 3 shipwrecks. Now that's very rare, but for an apostle to go through all that he went through, did Paul have reason to boast? Talk about an adventurous life. And he, of course, wrote the majority of the New Testament. So when you're reading the writings of Paul, you're reading about somebody who really lived a pretty adventurous life once they accepted Jesus. And he suffered for Christ. So if someone's going to boast about how they suffer for Jesus, Paul, I never even finished reading it all. I read 3 times I was shipwrecked, a night and the day I spent in the deep. In journeys often, in perils of water, in perils of robbers, in perils of my own countrymen, in perils of the Gentiles, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren, in weariness and toil, in sleeplessness often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness, beside all other things that come upon me daily, a deep concern for all the churches. And then he closes this off in verse 30 by saying, "If I must boast, I will boast in all the things that concern my infirmity." So if you're wondering what does boasting in the flesh mean and what is boasting in the spirit, now we're going to talk about boasting in the cross.